An Introduction to Medieval Money Lending and the Jewish Banking Myth, a podcast by Dr. Arpaia. In this podcast, I'll give a short introduction to the history of money lending and banking in medieval Europe. I seek to contextualize the development of myths about Jews and their business practices during the Middle Ages. I aim to explore how these myths reinforce socioeconomic forms of anti-Semitism that arose from the increasing presence of Jewish immigrants in Catholic Europe. If you do not remember why Jews began to settle in Catholic Europe, please go back and review the previous podcast entitled An Intro to Europe from Late Antiquity to the Middle Ages. The othering of Jews that we saw in Europe during the transition from late antiquity to the Middle Ages evolved according to new historical settings emerging in the 9th century. The medieval myth of Jewish banking was in reality a constellation of myths about Jewish business practices. Europeans reduced these myths to money lending because money lending was a new economic activity during the Middle Ages that captivated the imagination of European Catholics. These myths were socioeconomic in nature and built on the pre-existing Christian form of anti-Semitism that we've already studied. These socioeconomic myths were based on the Catholic juxtaposition of stereotypes about Jewish business practices on the one hand and Catholic business practices on the other. Socioeconomic myth-making in Europe and the telling and retelling of these myths belong to a much broader historical process. This process can be characterized by the emergence of primitive forms of capitalism in the second half of the Middle Ages. Early forms of European capitalism sprang up in urban areas alongside feudalism, which prevailed instead in rural areas. This early stage of capitalism is key to our understanding of a history of anti-Semitism. Capitalism is usually associated with industrialization, and for good reason. The discovery of capital and the realization of its enormous power to transform how we humans can create wealth became the motive force for industrialization for centuries. But the transformation of the European economy from traditional forms of agriculture to modern forms of industry occurred at a very slow pace. It began with mercantile capitalism, a primitive form of capitalism that was based on trade or commerce. Mercantile capitalism began with the growth of long-distance trade among Muslim, Chinese, and Indian merchants in the 8th and 9th century. Mercantile capitalism emerged a little later in Catholic Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries, when Catholic elites like Bishop Rudiger of Speyer encouraged trade among Catholic merchants and artisans, and invited Jewish merchants and artisans from the Muslim areas of the Mediterranean basin to settle in the few urban trading centers in Europe, because Catholic elites found Jewish knowledge and workmanship to be far superior to anything they had in their walled cities. Unlike China, Indian, and the Muslim areas of the West, Europe's dominant mode of production in the Middle Ages was feudalism, a unique mode of production, or way of producing wealth in society, that developed only in Christian Europe. If you do not remember how we define feudalism, be sure to go back to the previous podcast or to read the section in the required text dedicated to feudalism. The success of European commerce and trade led to the growth of mercantile capitalism in feudal Europe. The growth of mercantile capitalism meant that urban artisans and merchants grew in importance in medieval society. Cities, which were dominated by artisanal and merchant guilds, became centers of power and slowly eroded the feudal order. Feudalism had no room for the growing artisans and merchant classes, and merchants and artisans had no loyalty to the feudal system. Indeed, they increasingly challenged it because the feudal elite tried to control their power. The defenders of traditional feudal society began to fixate on money lending, an essential ingredient that the new mercantile elite exploited in commerce and a key source to the newfound wealth and power of merchant and artisanal guilds and their cities. Today, business people protect their business reputation and, as a result, are seen by some as some of the most respectable groups in modern society. During the first half of the Middle Ages, Catholic merchants, and especially itinerant ones, had one of the worst reputations in Europe, and for good reason. Customers routinely suspected them of adulterating products they sold. For instance, Germanic merchants routinely mixed flour, sand, and even dried mouse droppings into ground ginger and pepper to make money off the sale of these valuable spices. Another common practice was to counterfeit expensive products or to sell a useless product as something expensive. For instance, merchants routinely substituted dry goat dung for bay leaves, an expensive spice from the temperate zones of the Mediterranean. Customers suspected merchants of regularly playing around with weights and measurement, and with good reason. Falsifying weights and measurements was easy before the end of the 18th century because there was no standard weight or measurement anywhere in Europe. They varied from village to village. Wine and beer merchants regularly watered down their products, a practice facilitated by the fact that corks, which proved a bottle of wine or ale had not been tampered with, were not invented until the end of the 17th century by the Benedictine monk Dom Pierre Perignon. Medieval food merchants regularly sold rotten produce. One common trick was to place rotten food in the center of barrels, so that no matter which way the customer opened the barrel, they would not find the rotten produce immediately, thus giving the merchant deniability. The merchant could claim that the rot was the customer's fault. Adding to the low reputation of merchants, many of them regularly passed on debased coinage to their customers. They could get away with this practice because all monarchies and cities made their own coins, and many manipulated the quantity of gold and silver in them. Alternately, merchants could clip a coin, thus reducing its size and the quantity of gold and silver in it. Few Europeans understood how to determine accurately the quantity of gold and silver in a coin because they did not know how to calculate a coin's mass. Medieval merchants were a category of business people who were not to be trusted, not unlike the way most Americans look upon used car salespeople today. The fact that loans and interests were pioneered by merchants did not help the reputation of these practices. So it is perhaps understandable, given the medieval anti-Semitic Weltanschauung, that Catholics would assign this suspect activity unfairly to Jews. The expansion of trade in the West, beginning around the 12th century, served as an impetus to the growing importance of mercantile capitalism in feudal Europe. The most sought-after products in the Middle Ages came from Asia, an area of the world that Europeans called the East, because the area lay geographically to the east of Europe. It is an area of the world where the modern countries of Iran, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, China, Korea, Japan, and others are located today. During the Middle Ages, Asian products and merchants traveled along the Silk Road, one of the most important trade routes in history. Western access to the Silk Road was located in several cities in the eastern Mediterranean. Asian items purchased anywhere in Europe had to travel along the Silk Road through the eastern Mediterranean. In contrast to short-distance transactions, long-distance trade, whether originated in a faraway location in Europe or in Asia, required a greater outlay of capital than short-distance trade. Long-distance trade also involved a greater delay on a return on one's investment because of the time needed to transport items from the eastern Mediterranean to the rest of Europe, and that's assuming one did not have to purchase items further east. Transportation costs were higher. All merchants had to pay tolls to use roads, cross rivers, and to pass through cities. The longer the distance traveled, the more the tolls one had to pay. Risks associated with long-distance travel were also higher, So merchants had to find ways to mitigate risks, which also raised the price of goods. They had to find guides to take them across mountain ranges and through large forests. They needed technologically advanced ships to travel over rough seas. Guards were needed to escort merchants and merchandise, otherwise they became easy pickings for bandits and pirates. Travel to areas outside Catholic Europe added an additional dimension to the cost and risks associated with long-distance trade. The growing Muslim conquest of Asia Minor, where the modern-day country of Turkey is located, meant that Europeans could not necessarily count on a friendly reception in the eastern Mediterranean. With the decline in power of the Roman Empire centered on Constantinople, later called Byzantium, spices, cotton, and silk had to pass through Muslim control before they could be brought westward into other parts of the Mediterranean and northward into the rest of Europe. Muslim control of the eastern Mediterranean had an important impact on the development of trade in Europe. Muslim traders and political leaders used their control of access to the Silk Road to limit trade between Catholic Europe and Asia so that they could profit from European tastes for Asian products. They acted as middlemen for some of the most lucrative business activities in Europe, thus adding to their wealth and to the power of the growing Muslim empires in the eastern Mediterranean. The First Crusade temporarily reversed this trend when Catholic Europeans defeated the Muslims in the Holy Land and set up Crusader states there. European merchants discovered that Mediterranean islands like Malta and Cyprus were quite useful as launching points for trade in the eastern Mediterranean and Asia. Moreover, the existence of the Crusader states gave merchants leverage in dealing with Muslims who still controlled parts of Asia Minor and could control trade between the Mediterranean basin and points further east. The Crusades also introduced Europeans to Asian and Eastern Mediterranean products and whetted the appetite of Europeans from the lower ranks of the social order for pricey items that had been previously limited only to the wealthiest members of European society. European demands for goods from the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia spurred on the rapid growth of long-distance trade in Europe. In turn, the explosion in demand led to the creation of the banking industry. The Muslims subsequently reconquered the areas they had lost to the Christians during the First Crusade, and subsequent crusades failed to recoup European losses. Despite the return of Muslims as the sole middlemen for European trade with the East, the demand for Asian and Eastern Mediterranean goods only increased. So, just as Europeans gained a greater taste for the riches of the Eastern Mediterranean and Asia, the ability to purchase these products became more difficult, risky, and expensive. More or less contemporaneously with the Crusades, maritime republics on the Italian peninsula created vast Eastern Mediterranean empires to meet European demand for goods from Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean. These republics were dominated by merchants rather than the types of feudal elites one found elsewhere in Europe. The maritime republics, like the Venetian Republic illustrated here, conquered strategic trading centers and built fortified cities and ports. They negotiated trade deals with Crusader and Muslim kingdoms, which allowed their merchants to trade in cities outside their direct control. They mapped out trading networks and jealously guarded them by imposing navies. Cloth played an important role in the history of banking in Europe. Domestic cloth production in Europe had been limited mostly to wool during the Middle Ages, a cloth that is effective against the cold but can be quite uncomfortable. Cotton and silk were much highly sought after in Europe, but cotton came from the Asian subcontinent and Egypt. Silk, the more prestigious and expensive of the two, originated in China. While cotton production had been introduced to Egypt in ancient times, the Chinese government had a monopoly on silk production. Imperial governments in China secured a monopoly over silk production by keeping its production a state secret. They made the theft of silkworms and mulberry trees a capital offense. Nevertheless, already during late antiquity, the Roman Empire in Constantinople had succeeded in gaining a foothold in silk production. The Emperor Justinian sent a pair of monks to China as industrial spies to figure out the source of silk, to learn how to raise silkworms, and to steal enough silkworms and mulberry seeds to start silk production in the Roman Empire. Their success gave birth to a primitive silk production in the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantines were just as savvy as the Chinese in guarding the secret to silk cultivation. So other Europeans had to purchase silk from Byzantine merchants or to travel down the Silk Road to purchase it from the Chinese. Both options were dangerous and expensive. Worse still for Europeans, the Muslim conquests in the eastern Mediterranean from the 8th century onwards introduced another middleman for both the silk and cotton trade. By the Middle Ages, the fight between Catholics and Orthodox Christians over Christianity further complicated the silk trade for Europeans. Stealing the secret to silk production became an obsession for European cloth merchants and cloth guilds. They eventually succeeded and snuck silkworm eggs and mulberry cuttings into the rest of Europe. Since mulberry trees grow well in the Mediterranean basin and southern Europe, people on the Italian peninsula and in southern France and Spain could cultivate silkworms. A silk industry began to grow in other parts of Europe, and the price of silk, though still expensive, dropped, making silk an important and lucrative commodity for merchants, clergies, nobles, and burghers in the rest of Europe. The growing Muslim domination of the eastern Mediterranean culminated with the fall of Constantinople and to the end of the Roman Empire in 1453. Europeans now had to travel through areas under total Muslim control to obtain products from Asia, or they could trade with the maritime republics, which increasingly fought wars with the Muslim Ottoman Empire to preserve their trade routes to Asia. Cost for wars was passed on to European consumers of Asian and Eastern Mediterranean products. So, European countries outside the Mediterranean began exploring alternative trade routes to the riches of the Orient. These efforts led Portuguese traders to figure out a sea route by sailing south around the continent of Africa to the Asian subcontinent, China, and Japan. Since the Portuguese had sailed southward, Spanish traders decided to sail westward to create their own trade routes. In 1492, Christopher Columbus obtained funding from Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs of the newly created Spanish kingdom, to find their own way to cut out the Muslim middlemen. In the process, Columbus discovered the New World, which brought great wealth and power to Spain. Portuguese and Spanish merchants were followed in quick succession over the 16th and 17th centuries by Dutch, English, French, and Swedish traders, all sponsored by their respective monarchies. The discovery of the New World and expansion into Africa and Asia opened new economic possibilities for European monarchs, individual businessmen, and guilds. European monarchs and guilds invested heavily in new industries. Because the cultivation of silkworms and cotton was impossible in Northern Europe, monarchs there invested huge amounts of money, time, and effort to establish silkworm and cotton cultivation in the colonies they created in the temperate zones of the Americas. For instance, the British Crown sponsored silkworm and cotton cultivation in Virginia and Georgia. Ultimately, English silk enterprise failed in the two colonies, but cotton farming succeeded. The discovery of tobacco, its first use as a medicine and then as a lucrative consumer good, led the English to abandon silk production altogether. Soon the English had a near monopoly on tobacco and cotton production in Europe. To make the two industries more profitable, the English introduced chattel slavery, which was already in use by the Spanish, Portuguese, and French. They purchased black slaves in Africa, legally defined the children of slaves as slaves themselves, and used them to cultivate cotton and tobacco on an industrial scale in their colonies. The English made a fortune on the new slave economy. Indeed, England's great wealth, which lasted into the 20th century, began with the slave economy. During this period of global expansion, European wars were increasingly fought along these global sea routes and in colonial possessions, in addition to the battlefields of Europe. Take, for example, what we call the French and Indian War, and what Europeans call the 7 Years' War. Between 1756 and 1763, the English, British, and their allies fought for global mastery as far afield as the Holy Roman Empire, Poland, Russia, and the Mediterranean in Europe, the Ohio Valley and the plains of Quebec in North America, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile in South America, and India, which is part of Asia, and along the Gambia in West Africa. The period of world wars in which European countries were the principal belligerents had begun. Now that we have the larger historical context, let's return back to the Middle Ages and the intersection of the history of moneylending and the history of anti-Semitism. The expansion of long-distance trade in Europe and the globalization of European markets from the 12th to the 18th century increased the demands for loans. However, the Abrahamic religions all banned the practice of charging interest. First outlawed in the Hebrew holy books, Christian and Muslim scriptures also ban the practice as the sin of usury. Technically, usury included both overcharging, that is, pricing an item beyond what it cost to produce, and charging interest on money lent to anyone. In the growing search for capital, Catholic business people and merchants, in particular, began to look for ways to finance their businesses. To secure loans, they needed to get around the laws prohibiting usury. No one was willing to lend money for free. At first, lenders hid the practice of charging interest, or donated the interest charged to clients over their lifetime to the Catholic Church when they died. Using good deeds or paying Catholic clergy to pray for the salvation of one's soul was a backhanded way of expiating for the sin of usury. Over time, the expiation of sins was not enough of a reward. The practice gave way to business people disguising interest payments in ways that adhered to the letter of Judeo-Christian law that prohibited usury, but arguably violated the spirit of the law. They used the medieval legal system to certify merchant promissory notes and letters of exchange. These legal documents were issued in the amount of money equal to a sum that was loaned plus interest. Promissory notes and letters of exchange authorized the bearer of the note to collect a specified sum of money from the individual who had borrowed the money. Sometimes the legal notes specified when repayment would be made, but more often than not, the amount was payable upon request. For instance, if a merchant needed 10 gold coins for her business and found a merchant willing to loan her the sum, the two would agree upon an interest rate, say 2 gold coins. The borrower might sign a single promissory note for 12 gold coins, or 2 promissory notes for 6 gold coins apiece. The lender and the borrower might also put additional terms on the note. For instance, they might agree that the borrower would pay the bearer the amounts on the promissory note once the borrower's ships returned from the Eastern Mediterranean or Asia. Promissory notes and letters of exchange might also be used by merchants to allow them to travel from city to city without having to risk carrying large amounts of gold and silver coins with them. These financial documents acquired legitimacy from the crown and the church because they had to be notarized by a royal official who vouched for the authenticity of the document and the signature. These legal notes could disguise loans because they did not necessarily have to specify the reasons for their issuance. All that matters was the royal stamp, the signatures, and the amounts payable. Quickly enough, promissory notes and letters of exchange became commodities in their own right that could be bought and sold. Their value fluctuated according to what we understand today as the law of supply and demand. Thus they became, in fact, a sort of paper money, long before most countries abandoned the use of gold and silver as money in the 20th century. Starting around the 12th century, European merchants began to open businesses in several cities and invented another form of loan to facilitate the expansion of trade. The new form of credit became known as letters merchant. They differed from earlier forms of loans in two important ways. Letter merchants were paid by any member of a family to the bearer of the note. Remember, all businesses in the Middle Ages were family businesses. This new element made letters merchant more valuable than older methods for obtaining loans. They were backed by the good faith of a family, company, and not just an individual. Letters merchant also differed because they no longer required the intervention of the crown or church. They were issued by and for private parties. This lack of oversight offered merchants greater ease in using them for money-lending purposes. Like the older methods for obtaining loans, letters merchant acquired value as legal tender and became commodities that could be bought and sold according to the value people thought they had. The better the credit of a family or business, the more value the letters merchant would require. The worse the credit, the less the value. Promissory notes, letters of exchange, and letters merchant were not the only factors that encouraged money lending in medieval Europe. Additional factors chipped away at the stigma of usury. For all the sermons decrying usury as a sin, the Roman Catholic Church had never clearly defined usury in canon or church law. Furthermore, the very practicality of lending money chipped away at its social and cultural stigma. The expanding medieval economy made money lending acceptable as a necessary evil, at the very least, or a business opportunity at the other extreme. Medieval monarchs increasingly relied on borrowing to run their kingdoms. They were forever looking for ways to squeeze more and more money out of their subjects. Indeed, economic historians argue that the greatest limitation on the power of European monarchs was their inability to create dependable revenue streams. Warfare was arguably the most expensive activity in the Middle Ages. With the introduction of gunpowder, armies became larger, and whether monarchs drew on nobles, mercenaries, or militias, warfare became more costly over time. Even if monarchs were not fighting wars, they were not always able to pay for the upkeep of their realms or to face unexpected expenditures. Monarchs had to subsidize food prices, especially bread, to avoid bread riots that were costly to put down and easily got out of hand. Poor harvests and crop failure could lead to mass starvation, and subjects expected their monarchs to provide for them in times of need. Infrastructure needed to be rebuilt, and new roads and canals were required as the economy expanded. Monarchs had several options to increase their revenue. They could increase the number of taxes, but there were many drawbacks to this approach. Although neither the clergy nor the nobility paid taxes, the monarch needed their consent to create new taxes. So the whole society, clergy, nobility, and commons, might unite in asking for royal concessions in return for new taxes. Another danger was that the monarch's subjects might not be able to pay additional taxes. Overtaxation could then lead to tax revolts. Putting down tax revolts required additional money, and revolts could threaten the safety of the realm. Furthermore, if extra taxation might create additional funds, monarchs could not always count on full treasuries and enough time to face financial crises, so asking for new taxes was problematic. Another way to raise money was to ask the Catholic clergy to make a donation to the crown. Priests normally needed the monarch's approval to become bishops, and most bishops were related to the monarchy and the nobility by blood. so the crown might be able to convince the clergy to make a donation in times of need. But the clergy never took kindly to being asked to grant the crown money. Instead, they called these requests forced loans, which show how much these requests irked the clergy. Additionally, the papacy was jealous of the Catholic Church's exemption from taxation and might forbid the clergy to grant the request. So, requesting money from the clergy was also problematic. One principal source of royal funding was the sale of positions in the crown's administration. Magistrates, lawyers, advisors, tax collectors, and even mayors in some kingdoms all had to purchase their titles from the monarch. In return, they owned their jobs and made money by using their positions to enrich themselves. Although not all titles were inheritable, most were. When a titled person died, the heir paid the crown a fee in recognition of the king's original grant. Apart from the original sale and the fee for the inheritance of titles, the sale of titles was not an effective way to raise money. Another possible solution was to recall the coins of the realm and to adulterate it by adding base metals to the gold and silver coinage. The problem with this solution was that everyone knew that monarchs recalled coinage to debase it, and since a kingdom's coinage only had value according to the gold and silver it contained, debasing the coinage carried its own financial dangers. It caused inflation because the coins had lost value with less gold or silver content. Likewise, debasing the coinage made people have less faith in the monarchy. Clearly, debasing the coinage was not an effective means of royal finance. Another option was to borrow from wealthy subjects. The question was how to entice Catholic individuals or guilds to lend the crown money, especially since usury prevented monarchs from offering interest. So, European monarchs wound up resorting to the same fiscal mechanisms that medieval merchants used to buy and sell merchandise. Monarchs issued promissory notes to repay individuals and guilds for loans. To improve royal credit worthiness, repayment was guaranteed by the crown and not the individual monarch, much like letters merchant had replaced promissory notes and letters of exchange. Here was an effective way to expand royal finances. If royal loans were the best option for monarchs to raise funds, royal borrowing did have drawbacks. The crown might be unable to repay the bearer of royal promissory notes. However, this drawback could be mitigated if the monarch translated unpaid debts into royal favors. Alternately, the monarch might arrest the bearer of a promissory note, or worse, to avoid having to repay loans. But the monarch would need a reason. Otherwise, who would want to loan money to the monarch? Of course, the monarch could renege on repaying loans. Who would want to loan money to a deadbeat monarch? Because it was in the monarch's interest to repay loans, money lending to the crown became an effective way for monarchs to raise money and for wealthy elite to earn interest and secure favor with the crown. However, European monarchies discovered another option for raising funds that offered the least risk to them. Instead of antagonizing the clergy by extracting a forced loan, monarchs could extract one from the Jewish communities in their kingdom. The rules that applied to Catholics did not apply to Jews in Europe. Unlike Catholic elites who had powerful allies in the realm, and Catholic clerical elites who had powerful allies both in the kingdom and in Rome, Jewish communities had no allies. Unable to protect themselves and without allies, they were easily victimized by European monarchs. The presence of Jewish communities in a monarch's kingdom depended on the privileges the monarch had granted to them. If a few wealthy members of a Jewish community refused to lend the crown money, the monarch could simply revoke the privilege for the Jews to live in his kingdom and expel the whole Jewish community. This was a not-so-subtle form of blackmail. When it came time to repay Jewish lenders, monarchs could avoid having to repay the loans without ruining their credit rating, so to speak, by expelling the Jewish community. One disadvantage to expelling Jews was that they would take their property with them, including their gold and silver. Up until the 19th century, Europeans believed that the wealth and power of a kingdom was proportionate to the amount of gold and silver in the monarch's domain. Expulsions of Jews necessarily meant reducing the wealth of a kingdom as the departed took their wealth with them. So, legal scholars devised a way for monarchs to keep Jews from taking their wealth with them. They redefined Jews as serfs of the exchequer. First, let me explain what the words in the term meant, and then I will explain what the term signified in the Middle Ages. You will recall that serfs were commoners engaged in farming whose family agreed to work the land of a noble in return for a small portion of the yield. Under feudalism, serfs did not own the land they cultivated. In return for the permission to use land, a serf's family and offspring were obligated to till the land. Neither the serf nor his family nor his offspring could get out of the contract or leave the land without obtaining permission from the lord. If a serf was given the right to leave, he got nothing. The land, the living quarters, and most everything on it remained with the lord. It was the lord's property. The term exchequer is rarely used in the United States today, but it is still much in use in the United Kingdom. It is an Old English word for the state treasury. For instance, the British equivalent for our Secretary of the Treasury is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. The Exchequer or Treasury belonged to the monarch. It was his or her property to do with it as he or she wanted. The gold and silver in the Exchequer was used for many purposes, including to create the coinage of the realm. Now, I think you may have guessed already what medieval legal scholars were up to. By designating Jews in their kingdoms as serfs of the Exchequer, the Jews became analogous to serfs. Just as the serfs did not own the land, neither did Jews own the monarch's gold and silver coinage. Just as feudal lords of the land laid down the conditions under which serfs were granted the privilege of cultivating crops, so too monarchs could lay down the condition under which Jews were allowed to engage in commerce with the monarch's gold and silver coinage. Just as feudal lords stipulated the basis for farming on his or her land, so too the monarch had a legal basis for stipulating how Jews use his or her wealth. Monarchs also had a legal basis for demanding that wealthy Jews extended credit to the crown or be constrained to make a so-called forced loan. With monarchs increasingly dependent on high finance, an added benefit of the serf of the exchequer theory was that a monarch could prohibit wealthy Jews from lending to other monarchs or rival nobles. Remember that businesses were family affairs. Wealthy Jewish families invariably had relatives in more than one kingdom, just as Catholics did. So a monarch in one kingdom could put pressure on members of a Jewish or Catholic family to prevent the branches of the family in other kingdoms to raise the gold and silver for other monarchs. Moreover, for Jews, they were forbidden to take gold with them if they were expelled because, just as land belonged to the feudal lord, so too gold and silver belonged to the monarch. When a monarch was unwilling or unable to repay loans to Jewish bankers, the monarch simply expelled them and kept their gold and silver. Designating Jews as serfs of the exchequer thus avoided the negative consequences of stealing from lenders. Catholic lenders knew that they were treated differently because they were not Jews, and thus not serfs of the exchequer. The only way a monarch could seize the wealth of a Catholic was to find the head of the household guilty of a high crime. The theory of the Jews of the exchequer was put into practice throughout Europe. For instance, when Philip Augustus became king, he realized that he needed to raise huge sums of money to pay for the defense of his kingdom and to rebuild the kingdom's crumbling infrastructure. Since the French crown was already in debt to wealthy Jewish individuals, he expelled all of the Jewish communities rather than renege on his loans. To raise additional funding to rebuild his kingdom, he stipulated that all loans payable to Jews by his French subjects would be forgiven if the borrowers paid a percentage of the loan to the crown. Since giving the king about 25% of the amount borrowed from Jews was much more profitable than having to repay the whole sum, Philip Augustus earned the instant sympathy and loyalty of his subjects, and French society, both clergy and non, profited from the crown's expulsion of the Jews. So let's consider how moneylending had changed by the second half of the Middle Ages. Moneylending and commercial enterprise had become interconnected. Borrowing and lending were both integral parts of commerce. As commerce expanded, so did moneylending. The social and cultural value attributed to moneylending improved tremendously over the Middle Ages. Its value increased through its connection to business, but more importantly, its connection to monarchs. As monarchs engaged in borrowing money, it became what we might call today high finance. The more moneylending became a political concern, the more it became an affair of state. Politics was inconceivable without moneylending, and moneylending was inconceivable without politics. And yet, moneylending was transformed into something very different in the anti-Semitic worldview of the late Middle Ages. The social and cultural value of moneylending and the moneylender were distorted into something grotesque if the moneylender were Jewish. The anti-Semitic perception of reality juxtaposed Catholic and Jewish moneylending based on the religion and culture of the lender. Catholic moneylending was beneficial. Jewish moneylending was injurious. Take, for example, William Shakespeare's play, The Merchant of Venice. The story tells about the Jewish merchant Shylock, who gleefully tried to exact a pound of flesh from a Christian merchant who was unable to repay him a loan. Under Shakespeare's pen, the Jewish merchant of Venice was a nefarious, deceitful, and vengeful figure, the exact opposite of his Christian counterpart. Let's compare this notorious stereotype of the Jewish moneylender with the reputation of the Catholic de' Medici family of Florence. The family had made a small fortune as wool merchants. After moving into banking, they made so much money that they abandoned buying and selling wool to becoming one of the most important banking families in Europe. They eventually became so powerful that they served as the official bankers to the papacy. They parlayed their newfound power from moneylending into advantageous marriages with leading and noble families, thus increasing their family's power. Most famously, two of the de' Medici women became queens of France. Interestingly enough, the two daughters of this Catholic merchant family were counted among the most powerful monarchs the French ever had. 4 members of the de' Medici family also became popes, thus setting a record for any Catholic family in the history of the papacy, and a record that still holds to this very day. Many more members of the family were cardinals of the Catholic Church, the highest rank of clergy below the Pope. Clearly, European Jews did not have a monopoly on high finance or banking. So what about the myth of other nefarious Jewish practices? Simply put, the myth was based on half-truths, stereotypes, and downright lies. As we've seen, only a few Jews were bankers, and only a few bankers Jews. However, some monarchs preferred borrowing from Jews because it was so easy to steal from them. The Jews were serfs of the exchequer, so it literally paid for monarchs to borrow from Jews and to expel them, thus getting out of paying them and stealing their wealth to boot. By the second half of the Middle Ages, European merchants and artisans realized that extending credit made good business sense, and both Catholics and Jews extended credit to their customers. The reality of Jewish banking and moneylending in the Middle Ages was also very different from myth. We've already seen that Jewish lenders were at a great disadvantage when loaning money to Catholics. The disadvantage owed to the systemic nature of anti-Semitism in Europe. Jews were a separate category from everyone else, to whom special rules apply that did not apply to Catholics. Jews were serfs of the exchequer. Catholics were not. Monarchs could get away with stealing from Jews with impunity. It was much more difficult to get away with stealing from fellow Catholics. Likewise with small-time moneylending. Since the extension of credit to pay for products was not technically the same thing as loaning with interest, in spirit it was, those engaged in the practice argued that it was both beneficial and permissible. Again, some Catholic clergy still denounced these practices as usury and called for their eradication. The clergy's way of associating these practices with Jews was one way to win over their audience. After all, Europeans already had a jauntist view of Jews. The Catholic clergy's focus on Jewish moneylenders had the added effect of fueling the myth that usury was something that all Jews did, and that Jewish business people were involved in shady business practices. We find other parallel developments during the Middle Ages alongside the vilification of Jews. As we've seen, Christian moneylending was practiced by more and more members of society. So, by the 16th century, Catholic religious authorities normalized the practice. They redefined usury as moneylending at exorbitant levels of interest, whatever that meant, instead of defining it as simply charging interest. In the meantime, the Reformation, a period that began in the 16th century and lasted into the 17th century, produced a schism or permanent division. Catholic Europe was now divided into opposing camps of Protestants and Catholics. If the two groups disagreed on most everything, they were united in their anti-Semitism. They shared the same anti-Semitic Weltanschauung. As we've seen, during the Middle Ages, the historical period that immediately preceded the Reformation, nefarious business practices, including usury, had become associated with Jews in the minds of Europeans. With the Reformation, both Protestants and Catholics espoused medieval socioeconomic forms of anti-Semitism. Indeed, the schism reinforced European anti-Semitism because the Reformation focused the elite and subordinate classes on questions of Christianity and Christian orthodoxy. The emphasis on religious differences among Protestants and between Protestants and Catholics also drew attention to differences between Christianity and Judaism. A second parallel development alongside the vilification of Jews during the same arc of time was that moneylending became a business necessity, as well as a constant in the public and private lives of most Europeans. By the 18th century, most Catholic and Protestant theologians and philosophers no longer considered moneylending, even with interest, a sin or a moral failing. Instead, unfairness separated good moneylending from bad moneylending. Since unfair business practices were associated with Jews, Jewishness became a marker of difference. Jewishness separated good and evil capitalism. This process of othering in the economic sphere, by which a Jewish business world existed and was supposedly evil, made the Catholic and Protestant business world, and not just banking and moneylending, out to be good. It is also important to consider a third development in Europe. European guilds expanded from the 12th century to the end of the 18th century. During this period, they increasingly dominated the social, economic, cultural, and political life of kingdoms. Although we think of European guilds as socioeconomic organizations, they were fundamentally religious in nature. Catholicism, and later both Catholicism and Protestantism, defined their rules and practices, and Jews were automatically excluded from belonging to them. As the guilds expanded, Jews were increasingly cut out of the trades to which they had contributed since first settling in Europe in the 9th century. Unable to move into agriculture because the feudal contracts, too, were limited to Catholics, Jews engaged in banking and money lending. Jews switched to banking and money lending for another reason. From the 12th to the 16th century, Catholic city leaders increasingly levied taxes on Jewish merchants and artisans to drive them out of their professions. During the Reformation, both Protestants and Catholics continued this practice. All these developments made banking and money lending increasingly the only professional option for urban Jews. Those Jews who did not have enough wealth to engage in money lending were slowly forced into poverty, or forced to emigrate eastward to Poland and Russia. Given the sea change in European elite attitudes towards business practices, it should not be surprising to us that the subordinate classes mirrored the same types of attitudes towards them and towards Jews. As historians point out, members of the subordinate classes looked upon Jewish merchants, moneylenders, and bankers as people who gained more wealth than them, but without working. Christians generalized these assumptions into stereotypes that they applied to all Jews. These negative stereotypes amplified the process of othering in European society. Christians juxtaposed Jews as shady, immoral characters and themselves as upright, moral people. As we shall see, the belief that Jews got wealthy without working was the springboard for later socioeconomic stereotypes that Jews were involved in illegal activities such as larceny, fraud, and prostitution. Moreover, since most Europeans could not read or do math, they were not likely to understand how much interest they owed or the terms of repayment, especially if they had to ask for more time to repay loans. Thus, the subordinate classes in Europe and its colonies chose to believe that Jews cheated them out of their hard-earned money. Again, it bears repeating that these practices were done by European Christians too, and members of the subordinate classes reacted by using the Jewish marker of difference to Christians. They accused other Christians who they thought treated them unfairly as acting like Jews. Borrowers felt anger for being in debt to Jewish leaders, especially when they assumed that Jewish shady business practices and unfair money lending were the causes for their economic misery. They also felt shame for falling into debt, a feeling that was amplified among Protestants who held that indebtedness was owing to a character flaw in borrowers. Christians vented their anger and embarrassment on all Jews, and not just Jewish lenders. They exacted revenge for what they assumed were illegal and shady business practices, of which all Jews were guilty. To make matters worse for Jewish communities, Christians already considered them to be in league with the devil. So, stealing or murdering Jews differed from stealing or murdering from Christians. Violence against Jews was justifiable and should be permissible.